Hi everybody, it's Debbie with Cool Cats Art. Well, I've had a number of people ask me about mixing my paints for the blooms, and there's lots and lots of recipes out there. Everybody seems to have their favorite one. So I'm going to show you the one that I'm real happy with, that I've been using a lot lately on my blooms. And you can try it out and see if it works for you. Let me say something before we get started about mixing paints for any acrylic pour technique, actually. Most artists will give you a generalized recipe, like 2 parts paint, 3 parts of pouring medium, whatever. And if they do that, that's a starting point, but that can't be set and nothing else done to it, because all paints have different densities. There's different densities between all the tube paints, between brands. In fluid arts and pigments, there's no 2 paints that have the same density. So a set recipe where you do the same amount for each time is not going to work, because these paints have different densities, and even if you use the exact amounts of 2 to 1 or whatever it is, they're going to have different consistencies. That's why most recipes will say thin or thicken to consistency. Now, consistency on blooms is tricky. It can be hard to achieve and hard to measure. Most people just say, wait till it leaves such and such a mound in the cup after you mix it. And what's the amount of trace? Does it stay up for 2 seconds, 3 seconds? I don't see too many people that want it up for 3. Most people want it up for around 2. And that's not bad. That's eyeballing it. And that's certainly not bad. And I do that myself. But you can also use a consistency chart, like I have here. Hope you can see that, because I'm not looking at a monitor. The way you use it on a consistency chart is, once you get your paint mixed up in the cup, your colors, you put a daub of it inside this little circle, and you tilt it up straight for 5 seconds. Then you lay it down flat, and you see where it falls on the scale here. Most blooms are going to need to fall, the colors are going to need to fall somewhere around, I like mine to fall somewhere between 1 and 2. That's where I like which is a thicker paint, because bloom paints are thicker, your colors, than I guess any other pouring technique. But this is, and it's not foolproof and it's not wholly scientific, but it gives you a pretty good idea, until you get the knack of what it needs to look and feel like, of whether or not your paints are the same consistency. And when you do that for each color that you're using, then you can see what the difference is. And if you want it to, if one paint falls below 2 and you want it to set no lower than 2, then you need to thicken that paint, because it's too thin. And if one of the paints is barely moving and doesn't even reach the 1, then you know you've got to thin that paint. Even though you've used the same measurements on each one of them, they will not be the same consistency, usually, without thinning them down or putting something in it to thicken it up. So we're going to work it several ways. I'm going to mix, we will use this to see how they compare. And then we will also do the drip test. And I'm going to mix up 3 types of paint today, the 3 types of paint you're going to be using in your pours, which are going to be pigments, or fluid ink rather, and a tube paint. And let me say this, transparent paints are always going to be a lot less dense than opaque paints. I don't care what brand it is, where you got it from, a transparent paint is going to be a lot thinner and less dense than an opaque paint. The fluid ink, of course, is like water. It's inky. It's very liquid, and you're not going to have to add much thinning agent to your pouring medium when you use Fluid Art. I really like it for that. For blooms, there's a lot less trouble involved. Pigments are kind of the same because you turn them into a fluid. You disperse them before you mix them with your pouring medium, so they're similar. But we're going to do one of each. And the pouring mediums that I use, the house paints that I use for my pouring medium, now, currently, here in February of 2025, for future reference if you're watching this video, these are the two products that I'm using. Most people have, since the Behr 8300 got bad and they had to pick a new Behr product to use, I'm using the Behr Dynasty that most people are using. You may not be able to see this for the shadowing. And the can number is 3653. It's got a green stripe on it that says Deep Base. I'll put that down in the description box anyway for you. It's thick. Maybe not quite as thick as the Behr 8300, but it's thick. And then I'm also using a Valspar product, the High Gloss Ultra, interior plus exterior. And it's a base C, and the can number is 333125. That will also be in the description box. Now, between these two paints, I can mix tube paint, fluid, ink, or pigments. It doesn't matter. These two. If I need to thin the paints, I do not use varnish anymore because, and a lot of people are trying to move away from that because varnish can really make your sales kind of wonky. Most people will agree with that. I'm using GAC 100 by Golden to thin these paints after I mix them up with the pouring medium if they need it. It is a binder. It won't cause your paint to become thin and weak. It'll help it. And I've not had any trouble with wonky sales using this. I also disperse my pigments with GAC 100. I don't do it with varnish. Okay, I'm going to open these cans and show you the difference in the thickness of them. And there is a wide difference. The Behr Dynasty is kind of smelly. And honestly, I need to put a mask. It's just me because I'm really, really sensitive to smells. So I'm probably going to pop a mask on while I'm mixing this stuff so that I'm not overcome with the fumes. It's not real bad. It's just that I'm very sensitive. So let me grab a mask. And hopefully you'll still be able to hear me well enough while we go through this phase. This is how I'm going to have to do it, I'm afraid. Okay, the Behr Dynasty, it's flowing from the stick really, really well. You can't see this in the can, but it's making about a 1, 2, maybe 3 second trace down in the puddle. This is the Ultra. Which looks white, but it will dry clear. It is not as thick. When it falls off the stick, it makes about a 1 second trace back in the paint can. It's a lot thinner than the Dynasty. So, let's start out first of all with a tube paint. With the tube paints, now this is depending upon how much paint you need. I'm doing some smaller canvases, and I don't need a whole ton of paint. If I need more, I'll mix up more. I really don't measure this, okay? So I just put a squirt of a small dollop of the tube paint. This is a Pebeo high viscosity transparent paint. And it's gonna, I know that transparent paints are a lot thinner and less dense than opaque paints, right? So if I'm gonna mix this tube paint up, and I know it's a transparent, I'm probably gonna do about a 50-50 mix of the Behr Dynasty with the Valspar. So I'm going to start, and I'm not measuring this. I'm just kind of letting it drip off the stick. Exact measurements are really not necessary. It's the consistency of your paints when you're done with all of the colors that makes the most difference. So I'm going to drizzle some in there. And then I'm going to come over here to the Valspar, and I'm going to drizzle an amount over here. Now, this is where I'm starting. Okay, now let's get this mixing. I'm back. My recorder stopped recording. I got a telephone call and it interrupted it. So I was mixing this tube paint, and it's probably going to be really hard to see. I don't know if you can or not because I'm not looking at a monitor. It's flowing really easy off my stick, and it's leaving about a 1-2 trace in the cup, and that's good. So I'm happy with this, the way it looks in the cup. Now I'm going to wait till I get all 3 of these mixed up before I put it on the consistency chart so we can actually look at them all together. I'm going to put the lid on that because this paint, it always amazes me, dries so fast. It's just crazy how quickly it can dry up sitting in a cup, and even with a lid on it. So sometimes if it looks like it's a little too thin to me, if I let it sit around in the cup for 10 or 15 minutes, open, it thickens up. Okay, so we got the tube paint done. And I use basically 50% of the Dynasty and 50% of the Valspar. And that was with a transparent tube paint. All right, so next we'll do a fluid ink, fluid acrylic. Now, because these are so liquid, I've been just using the straight Dynasty because it's thick. And adding the fluid acrylic to it seems to make it just about right. So let's open this and put some drops in there. It basically just how saturated do you want it to be. You can add more or less color to it. Golden paints are very richly pigmented, and you usually don't need very much of them to get what you need. And even this little bit thinned down the Behr Dynasty quite a bit. Now, I haven't put any Valspar in there because it's thinner than the Dynasty, and so I don't think I'm going to need it. But let's see. It's mixing up good. And I'm getting, it's a little thinner than the tube paint that I just mixed up. I think it could be, because it's only leaving me about a 1 second trace. I probably need to thicken it up a little bit more with the Behr Dynasty. So I'm putting a little bit more in there. If it had been too thick, which it never has been yet, using the Dynasty alone, I would have thinned it out with GAC 100. This is better. This is staying up for about a 2-second trace, which is about what I want. It flows off the stick really, really nice, and that's good. Okay. Those are two beautiful colors, I must say. All right, let me pop the lid on that, and the next one we're going to do is the pigments. There we go. Gotta hear that snap. All right. Now for the pigments. This is this little piggy pigment, one of my favorites. I think it's Mermaid. Semi-transparent. Well, we got to disperse it first, of course, so I don't measure. I just put a dollop of the pigment, and that's quite a bit actually, in the bottom of my cup. Put the lid back on, and then I'm going to disperse it with the GAC. I got a clump of something that fell down in this the other day, so I really need to strain it. And then we're going to mix that up until it dissolves, disperses, whatever you want to call it. Such a beautiful color. Now this acts pretty much like a fluid paint once you disperse it. If you were using a pigment paint to make a cloud pour or any other kind of pour that you're going to just use American Floetrol with, you would have to thicken this up to the consistency of a tube paint because it won't be thick enough once you add that liquid Floetrol to it. You'd have to use a thickening agent. I use a heavy gel gloss to mix in here with it and make it thick. So then you can use it like a tube paint. Okay, that's pretty good. Now, I think I'm going to start with just the Behr Dynasty alone in it. I don't think there's going to be enough fluid in there to keep it with the Behr Dynasty alone. I'm probably going to have to thin this out with the, that was about 2 drops, drizzles off the stick. I'm probably going to have to thin this out with a little bit of the Valspar. Well, that's really actually not too bad. The proof will be in the consistency chart. Let's see how all 3 paints fall on that, and then I'll know which ones I need to thicken or thin. Okay, let's get them out here. Now, I don't always do this, but in the beginning, I don't do it much anymore, but in the beginning, when you're not quite sure if those consistencies are really close to each other, you can do it until you start to get the feel for it by how it drips or by how long the mounds stay up and etc. You'll begin to sense it and know. But we're going to do the consistency chart just to compare that and see what happens. Okay. Oh, wow. This was my golden that I used with just the Behr Dynasty. Wow, it's thickened up in no time, and I've had the lid on it no less. Okay, the trick to this is not overfill the little circle. And I got it off center there, and that's not good. I think I'll try the other one beside it. That's good. Then we'll try the tube paint transparent. It's thickened up some too. That's what I mean about these paints thickening up in the cup as they sit. So you can really start them out a little bit thinner than you feel comfortable with because they're going to thicken. Usually when they've been sitting around for a while, you have to thin them out. Okay, here's the pigment, and it's still pretty liquid. It may be too thick, too thin. A little dollop of that, okay. Like I say, it's not an exact science, but it's gonna give us an idea. Let's tilt it up. 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000, 5, 1,000. Okay, so it looks like this has reached 1, and that's okay. I can live with that. This one was the pigment, and as you can see, it has run and is quite a bit, it's too much. So I'm going to have to thicken the pigment up. The pigment is too thin. These two, the tube paint and the fluid acrylic, they're just about right. So now I know I need to take the pigment paint and add a little bit more Dynasty to it to help thicken it up, which I really thought I was going to have to do that anyway. I didn't measure it, I just dropped some in there. That's good enough. And boy, it's still running a little too fluid. I can tell it by looking at it in the cup. Now, the thing is, this is much better. If I let this sit around for about 5 minutes, it's probably going to be right where it needs to be. But let's try one more consistency chart test and see if we've helped it any. 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000, 5, 1,000. It's better, but it's still running quite a bit thinner than the other two, although it's quite better. So I know through experience, if I just let this sit here for about 5 minutes with no lid on it, it's going to pretty much be right about where I need it to be. So I'm not going to do anything else to it right now, because the more Dynasty that I add to it, it's the lighter the color is getting, of course, because I'm thinning it out with the Dynasty. So we're going to leave them at that. And I'm going to pop a lid. I'm not going to pop a lid on that one because I want it to sit out for just a few minutes. But I'm going to pop a lid on these other ones because they are thickening up as we speak. Now, the Behr Dynasty is a lot more expensive than the Valspar. So I try to use as little of it as I can get away with. I don't have to use very much of it if I'm using a tube paint. In fact, you may not have to use any of it at all with a tube paint. If I were using a tube paint, I would start out with just the Valspar and mix it up and see how you feel about it. It may be enough on its own. I try to use it on its own without the Dynasty whenever I can. And if you just use the Valspar, it's fine. The cells hold up well. There's no trouble with that. It's very stable. So it's perfectly fine to use on its own if you need to. Okay, well that's how I mix currently my paints for blooms. And as products come and go, and the formulas come and go with those products, like it did with Behr 8300, this is all subject to change as we go along. But right now, in February of 2025, this is what I see me using until further notice. And I'm not the only one using these. There's a lot of artists that are using them. And they're working beautifully. Okay, well that's it for my mixing video. Thank you for joining me. I took my mask off now. You can probably hear me better. Thank you for joining me. And if you would, in the comments, you can leave a message to me of what you would like to see me demonstrate or teach in the line of fluid art. And I'll try to address that in some later videos. Thank you. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you again.